Welcome to the second whiskey lecture. I'm drinking again a Woodford Reserve. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, then you can find the full lecture on my Substack if you subscribe there. Now I'm going to continue reading from Emerson's essay History, which is an essay really on memory. And as I'm reading, I will think along with it, which is what commentare, to comment, means, after all. There is at the surface infinite variety of things. At the center there is simplicity of cause. How many are the acts of one man in which we recognize the same character? Observe the sources of our information in respect to the Greek genius. We have the civil history of that people, as Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, and Plutarch have given it, a very sufficient account of what manner of persons they were and what they did. We have the same national mind expressed for us again in their literature, in epic and lyric poems, drama and philosophy, a very complete form. Then we have it once more in their architecture, a beauty as of temperance itself, limited to the straight line and the square, a builded geometry. Then we have it once again in sculpture, the tongue on the balance of expression, a multitude of forms in the utmost freedom of action and never transgressing the ideal serenity. Like votaries performing some religious dance before the gods, and though in convulsive pain or mortal combat, never daring to break the figure and decorum of their dance. Thus of the genius of one remarkable people we have a fourfold representation, and to the senses what more unlike than an ode of Pindar, a marble centaur, the peristyle of the Parthenon, and the last actions of Phorcyon. Every one must have observed faces and forms which, without any resembling feature, make a like impression on the beholder. A particular picture or copy of verses, if it do not awaken the same train of images, will yet superinduce the same sentiment as some wild mountain walk, although the resemblance is nowise obvious to the senses, but is occult and out of the reach of the understanding. Nature is an endless combination and repetition of a very few laws. She hums the old well-known air through innumerable variations. So here again we have Emerson's nearly seamless moving between and from and in between history to nature, nature to history. The laws of nature are not the laws of history, of course, but there is a likeness between nature and history. They have not a similarity in laws, but there is a regularity to nature and history. Nature is full of sublime family likeness throughout her works, and delights in startling us with resemblances in the most unexpected quarters. I have seen the head of an old sachem of the forest which at once reminded the eye of a bold mountain summit, and the furrows of the brow suggested the strata of the rock. There are men whose manners have the same essential splendor as the simple and awful sculpture on the friezes of the Parthenon and the remains of the earliest Greek art, and there are compositions of the same strain to be found in the books of all ages. Emerson thus sees a relationship between the outward appearance of men until today and the awe-inspiring but also simple sculpture in the Parthenon and in the earliest Greek art. Art resembles nature and nature resembles art, if I may be allowed such almost a slogan-like manner of speaking. Now to continue. And there are compositions of the same strain to be found in the books of all ages. What is Guido's Rospigliosi Aurora but a morning thought, as the horses in it are only a morning cloud. Emerson here refers to a painting by Guido Reni, L'Aurore, which is to be found in the Palazzo Pallavicini Rospigliosi. It depicts Aurora, Morgenröte as you would say in German, as the personification of dawn, and she leads the sky god Apollo in his horse-drawn chariot across the sky. So Aurora and Apollo together leading dawn, and it is, as Emerson says, a morning thought, a thought of the morning. How could we think this further? A thought that is young, that is still fresh, that is dawn itself, is not memory in some sense, not really at all backward looking and museal, antiquarian as Nietzsche would sometimes think of it. But cannot memory be, to stay with Nietzsche, monumental also? In the sense that memory can be, when it enlivens and enriches us, when we cherish it in a manner that it can be such, it can be our Apollinian morning, our new dawn. Now Apollo is here accompanied by the Horae, the goddesses of seasons and hours in this painting. And of course, there are seasons to nature, there are seasons to history, and there are seasons also to memory. We may be, as Spengler says, children of the winter, children of the ashes. But still, memory could become, again, or point us towards the dawn, with Apollo and Aurora leading, if we here follow Emerson's enigmatic remarks. Now to continue with Emerson. If anyone will but take pains to observe the variety of actions to which he is equally inclined in certain moods of mind, in those of which he is averse, he will see how deep is the chain of affinity. So rather than speaking of a chain of being here, Emerson speaks of a chain of affinity, of an affinity between the peoples, let's say. The peoples of Europe today and, of course, the people of Greek and of those of European descent who now dwell in the land that is America. A painter told me that nobody could draw a tree without in some sort becoming a tree, or draw a child by studying the outlines of its form merely, but by watching for a time his motions and place. The painter enters into his nature and can then draw him at will in every attitude. So Roos entered into the inmost nature of a sheep. I knew a draughtsman employed in a public survey who found that he could not sketch the rocks until their geological structure was first explained to him. In a certain state of thought is the common origin of very diverse works. It is the spirit and not the fact that is identical. Now crucially also, yes, it is spirit, but it is spirit that is itself inspirited and indwelled by memory, which is not universal and not particular. I think those are false dichotomies. And also not collective, which is just another way of saying universal memory. Instead, memory, perhaps we can think of as the sea that surrounds an island, the sea in its tides, the sea in its own weather seasons. And there's a chain of affinity, again, that binds certain people together, and that also differentiates or separates others from each other, or even, of course, a people within can become separated and estranged from itself or from one another within. So this deeper apprehension of which Emerson speaks cannot really be gained by more skills, let's say, today, by having better or faster computers, by deploying intelligent machines that have access to all the information. All that information is absolutely worthless without that chain of affinity, without that not just sense of belonging, but that clear and profound, real belonging to a certain chain, which allows us in the first place, by the way, to imitate it all. We couldn't imitate the Greeks or aspire to do so if there weren't a genuine chain of affinity with them. So no amount of information or data will be able to make up for what is lost if genuine affinity is lost, and even what Goethe would call elective affinity. There can be elective affinities, but they can still be genuine. We can feel, to give a very simple example, very close to someone that we are not blood related with. We can actually also leave our home and find new roots elsewhere, and can still be deeply appreciative and find that we have profound affinity with the place that we now call home, or that we have come to call home. It has been said that common souls pay with what they do, nobler souls with that which they are. And why? Because a profound nature awakens in us by its actions and words, by its very looks and manners, the same power and beauty that a gallery of sculpture or of pictures addresses. So again, common souls pay with what they do, nobler souls with that which they are. So nobler souls are deeply connected in a chain of affinity with the past. And this is what they are. And this is how they pay their way, or even pave their way, let's say, in life. Civil and natural history. The history of art and of literature must be explained from individual history or must remain words. There is nothing but is related to us. Nothing that does not interest us. Kingdom, college, tree, horse or iron shoe. The roots of all things are in man. Now again, if we think now of our time, why, of course, AI, etc., must be parasitical on man, because all is in us. All is in that which is human memory, which at once transcends humanity, but also always relates back and comes back to the human being. All is in man. Kingdom, college, tree, horse, or iron shoe. Now we see here what Emerson addresses. The ways in which we organize, the ways in which we rule and are ruled, but also how we relate to nature, how we educate ourselves, how we relate to the animal kingdom. Santa Croce and the Dome of St. Peter's are, here it gets a bit strange, are lame copies after a divine model. Strasbourg Cathedral is a material counterpart of the soul of Erwin of Steinbach. The true poem is the poet's mind. The true ship is the shipbuilder. Now this is interesting. It's not entirely at all. One could think that this is just basically Platonism, that what we find in the world are already just images, copies. And hence one has to be careful with the poets and the carpenters or the craftsmen, because they imitate imitations. But note, Emerson flips this around here quite strikingly. The true poem is the poet's mind. And again, the true ship is the ship builder. Again, it is in man. It is in this worldly world and in the being of the human being that the ship is found, and not in some other world, some hinter world, which has come to be life-denying, as Nietzsche would say, or which has also led to thinking of this world as deceiving us. In the man, could we lay him open, we should see the reason for the last flourish and tendril of his work, as every spine and tint in the seashell pre-exists in the secreting organs of the fish. The whole of heraldry and of chivalry is in curtsy. A man of fine manners shall pronounce your name with all the ornament that titles of nobility could ever add. The trivial experience of every day is always verifying some old prediction to us, and converting into things the words and signs which we had heard and seen without heed. A lady with whom I was riding in the forest said to me that the woods always seemed to her to wait, as if the genii, the spirits who inhabit them, suspended their deeds until the wayfarer had passed onward. A thought which poetry has celebrated in the dance of the fairies, which breaks off on the approach of human feet. The man who has seen the rising moon break out of the clouds at midnight has been present like an archangel at the creation of light and of the world. I remember one summer day in the fields, my companion pointed out to me a broad cloud, which might extend a quarter of a mile, parallel to the horizon, quite accurately in the form of a cherub, as painted over churches, a round block in the center, which it was easy to animate with eyes and mouth, supported on either side by wide, stretched, symmetrical wings. What appears once in the atmosphere may appear often, and it was undoubtedly the archetype of that familiar ornament. I have seen in the sky a chain of summer lightning, which at once showed to me that the Greeks drew from nature when they painted the thunderbolt in the hand of Jove. I have seen a snowdrift along the sides of the stone wall, which obviously gave the idea of the common architectural scroll to abut a tower. Now again, Emerson weaves together myth and nature, memory, nature, and myth. He weaves together his own experience with mythology, with Greek mythology no less, with his experience of even extreme weather that has a resemblance to a tower, so that we begin to see that what he means by history really is memory extending itself, and memory almost as the, if you allow me that reification, as building blocks, as it were, so that what we can see, or let me rephrase that, what we see, or what we still can see even in a thunderbolt now, is still also the thunderbolt of Zeus or Jove or Jupiter. We can see in snowdrifts along stone walls, we can see a resemblance of a tower, so that what we build is a memory of those workings of nature. But we don't simply mimic or imitate. Again, we find it within ourselves in the poet's mind and in the shipbuilder himself, we find the ship, we find the poem. Which is to say that we are related to memory and memory relates to us. And hence the world is meaningful. By surrounding ourselves with the original circumstances, we invent anew the orders and the ornaments of architecture, as we see how each people merely decorated its primitive abodes. The Doric temple preserves the semblance of the wooden cabin in which the Dorian dwelt. The Chinese pagoda is plainly a Tartar tent. The Indian and Egyptian temples still betray the mounds and subterranean houses of their forefathers. The custom of making houses and tombs in the living rock, says Heeren in his researches on the Ethiopians, determined very naturally the principal character of the Nubian Egyptian architecture to the colossal form which it assumed. In these caverns, already prepared by nature, the eye was accustomed to dwell on huge shapes and masses, so that when art came to the assistance of nature, it could not move on a small scale without degrading itself. What wood statues of the usual size or neat porches and wings have been associated with those gigantic halls before which only colossi could sit as watchmen or lean on the pillars of the interior. Now here, with the reference to this work on the Ethiopians and Nubian Egyptian architecture, we see Emerson, through reading about these civilizations and cultures and tribes, we see him moving to a different region of memory, of human memory, that in its own right and in its own way also has its place in human memory. But it's specifically, of course, important to stress that it has this in its own way, in its own right. The Gothic church plainly originated in a rude adaptation of the forest trees, with all their boughs, to a festal or solemn arcade, as the bands about the cleft pillars still indicate the green withers that tied them. No one can walk on a road cut through pine woods without being struck with the architectural appearance of the grove, especially in winter, when the barrenness of all other trees shows the low arc of the Saxons. In the woods, in a winter afternoon, one will see as readily the origin of the stained glass window with which the Gothic cathedrals are adorned, and the colors of the western sky seen through the bare and crossing branches of the forest. Nor can any lover of nature enter the old piles of Oxford and the English cathedrals without feeling that the forest overpowered the mind of the builder, and that his chisel, his saw, and plane still reproduced its ferns, its spikes of flowers, its locust, elm, oak, pine, fir, and spruce. Now, here we have a stark difference to Spengler. Spengler believed that the Gothic cathedrals are pointing like spaceships, like rockets, away from the earth towards a pure transcendence, and that the stone is even transcended in its weight in the Gothic cathedrals attempt to leave the earth behind and enter heavens. So Spengler sees a direct connection of the consequence of Faustian man trying to conquer space, because Faustian man is purely spatial, and Gothic cathedrals which stand at the very beginning of this 1,000-year-old civilization. Now in Emerson we find a strikingly different understanding of Gothic cathedrals especially, of course, of Oxford and English cathedrals, which are still of the forest. In a sense, the forest, the deep, wide forests of England, overpower the builder, and this sensation of overpowering of nature is what led the builders build the cathedrals and their magnificent, awe-inspiring, transcendent aim. It is nature again, earth, groundedness in soil, and not just a sheer attempt at utmost transcendence and withdrawal from the earth. The Gothic cathedral is a blossoming in stone subdued by the insatiable demand of harmony in man. The mountain of granite blooms into an eternal flower, with the lightness and delicate finish, as well as the aerial proportions and perspective of vegetable beauty. In like manner, all public facts are to be individualized, all private facts are to be generalized. Then at once history becomes fluid and true, and biography deep and sublime. As the Persian imitated in the slender shafts and capital of his architecture the stem and flower of the lotus and palm, so the Persian court in its magnificent era never gave over the nomadism of its barbarous tribes, but travelled from Ecbatana, where the spring was spent, to Susa in summer, and to Babylon for the winter. So history is true when it is fluid. And biography is deep and sublime when history is fluid. When, again to use Emerson's language, when facts are individualized, or public facts, are individualized, and private facts are generalized. What does it mean for history to be fluid? It means that at once what we experience is not purely individual, but also what happens, let's say, on a grander scale is not purely public or not purely general or universal, to use again the language of Emerson. But it is instead always both at once, individualized and public, private and generalized, so that one begins to see oneself in part of the grander stream of history and of the ocean that is memory. This is what makes any biography, so any writing of one's life, deep and sublime at the same time. Deep in the sense that it connects us to this deep chain and the deep ocean whose waves and tides structure our memory, but at the same time sublime, so at the same time taking us out of ourselves and also, in some sense, terrifying. In the early history of Asia and Africa, nomadism and agriculture are the two antagonist facts. The geography of Asia and of Africa necessitated a nomadic life, but the nomads were the terror of all those whom the soil or the advantages of the market had induced to build towns. Agriculture, therefore, was a religious injunction, because of the perils of the state from nomadism. And in these late and civil countries of England and America, these propensities still fight out the old battle in the nation and in the individual. The nomads of Africa were constrained to wander by the attacks of the gadfly, which drives the cattle mad, and so compels the tribe to emigrate in the rainy season and to drive off the cattle to the higher sandy regions. The nomads of Asia follow the pasturage from month to month. In America and Europe, the nomadism is of trade and curiosity, a progress certainly from the gadfly of Astaboras to the Anglo and Italomania of Boston Bay. Sacred cities, to which a periodical religious pilgrimage was enjoined, or stringent laws and customs tending to invigorate the national bond, were the check on the old rovers. and the cumulative values of long residence are the restraints on the itinerancy of the present day. So again here, through memory, Emerson weaves human being together and tries to show that in some sense we are still nomadic. He does speak of progress, that we no longer have to just flee from a threat from an insect, but at the same time we are on a pilgrimage also, by its own customs and of course bounded often by national custom or religious rule, etc. But we are still wandering. And we are wandering, to speak more poetically, not just across the lands, but we are wanderers through memory. The antagonism of the two tendencies is not less active in individuals, as the love of adventure or the love of repose happens to predominate. A man of rude health and flowing spirits has the faculty of rapid domestication, lives in his wagon, and roams through all latitudes as easily as a Kalmuk. At sea or in the forests or in the snow, he sleeps as warm, dines with as good appetite, and associates as happily as beside his own chimneys. Or perhaps his facility is deeper seated in the increased range of his faculties of observation, which yield him points of interest wherever fresh objects meet his eyes. Now, and if this is not a true American spirit speaking, Emerson is one of the predominant American thinkers, one of the most precious testimonies that we have of the American experience. The people, no less, for whom the frontier no longer was dangerous or to be avoided, but the frontier was something to be aspired to move towards and to burst through. Emerson's frontier spirit here really, I think, shines through, as so many Americans still today share in this frontier spirit, this longing to be at home everywhere. But on a deeper level and aside from just an American experience, I think what he also tries to relate here is that we can travel to the strangest places, the most foreign lands, and we can still find some connection there, even if we have absolutely nothing whatsoever in common with the people there, or with their customs, or even the climate of the place. Because what ultimately bounds all together is that chain of deep affinity that memory has for the human being. The pastoral nations were needy and hungry to desperation, and this intellectual nomadism and its excess bankrupts the mind through the dissipation of power on a miscellany of objects. The home-keeping wit, on the other hand, is that continence or content which finds all the elements of life in its own soil, and which has its own perils of monotony and deterioration if not stimulated by foreign infusions. So he warns against both, or doesn't warn, but describes the excesses of both. The hunger of those nations, England comes to mind, who need to, as the great whale does, always swim away and take possession. On the other hand, there are what he calls the home-keeping nations, of home-keeping wit, who are just content with their ethnocentrism, but that lapses easily into monotony and even degeneracy, we could say. If it isn't, to quote Emerson again, stimulated by foreign infusions. Memory becomes pale if it is only isolated onto itself. It ossifies, so it needs that fluidity again, which can come through sometimes a shock from the outside or a polite, mild and soft foreign infusion. Everything the individual sees without him corresponds to his states of mind, and everything is in turn intelligible to him, as his onward thinking leads him into the truth to which that fact or series belongs. The primeval world, the foreworld, as the Germans say, I can dive to it in myself, as well as grope for it with researching fingers in catacombs, libraries, and the broken reliefs and torsos of ruined villas. The foreworld, the primeval world, the worlds that came before. We have any connection to them, Emerson tells us here. Again, because of that deep affinity that memory has for us and that we have for memory itself. This is why we can walk into old ruins and still see a resemblance or a semblance or an echo, a flickering, dying light of a former world shining forth. What is the foundation of that interest all men feel in Greek history, letters, art, and poetry, in all its periods from the heroic or Homeric age down to the domestic life of the Athenians and Spartans 4 or 5 centuries later? What but this, that every man passes personally through a Grecian period? The Grecian state is the era of the bodily nature, the perfection of the senses, of the spiritual nature unfolded in strict unity with the body. In it existed those human forms which supplied the sculptor with his models of Hercules, Phoebus, and Jove. Not like the forms abounding in the streets of modern cities, wherein the face is a confused blur of features, but composed of incorrupt, sharply defined and symmetrical features, whose eye sockets are so formed that it would be impossible for such eyes to squint and take furtive glances on this side and on that, but they must turn the whole head. The manners of that period are plain and fierce. The reverence exhibited is for personal qualities: courage, address, self-command, justice, strength, swiftness, a loud voice, a broad chest. Luxury and elegance are not known. A sparse population and want make every man his own valet, cook, butcher, and soldier, and the habit of supplying his own needs educates the body to wonderful performances. Such are the Agamemnon and Diomed of Homer, and not far different is the picture Xenophon gives of himself and his compatriots in the retreat of the 10,000. After the army had crossed the river Teleboas in Armenia, there fell much snow, and the troops lay miserably on the ground covered with it. But Xenophon arose naked, and taking an axe began to split wood, whereupon others rose and did the like. Throughout his army exists a boundless liberty of speech. They quarrel for plunder. They wrangle with the generals on each new order, and Xenophon is as sharp-tongued as any, and sharper tongued than most, and so gives as good as he gets. Who does not see that this is a gang of great boys with such a code of honor and such lax discipline as great boys have? The costly charm of the ancient tragedy, and indeed of all the old literature, is that the persons speak simply. Speak as persons who have great good sense without knowing it, before yet the reflective habit has become the predominant habit of the mind. So according to Emerson, this is a wonderful insight. We have in these old ancient tragedies by Xenophon and Sophocles and Homer, the great epics handed down to us, we have here men speaking in a simple manner, speaking the most profound things, saying the most profound things without having to reflect on them. Young, youthful they are, not yet burdened by millennia on which we look back, and often enough look back upon without drawing sense from out of them. So, the Greeks are not reflective. There's not yet a habit of being reflective in the mind, but the mind seems connected to something else. Admiration of the antique is not admiration of the old, but of the natural. And there it is. Emerson tells us, we don't fetishize the old, as we might say, but instead we here admire that nativity of the Greeks, that youthfulness of their being. The Greeks are not reflective, but perfect in their senses and in their health, with the finest physical organization in the world. By the way, I'm thinking, in some sense, of course, having to be reflective, as we have to be, also has to do with memory. We are, in some sense, burdened with memory, perhaps in a way that no generation before us has been. We have to somehow make sense of the ruins of the greatest civilizations, uncountable data in front of us, new findings of catacombs and ruins, cave drawings, the entire planet discovered and now encircled by satellites. Nearly everything, it seems, filmed, at least potentially, in real time, a record of almost every single day of our lives. Even if we want to have one, we can certainly make one in a perfectly linear fashion. We can photograph every situation of our lives, but we can also, at a fingertip, travel through the eons, just flicker through gazillions upon trillions of images and videos, and now also AI produced images of just about anything that we want to see. But do we ever really see? Are we ever really here in touch with the chain of memory? Or are we not grasped by something more parasitical, something that appears to be memory but really isn't, something that is parasitical on us and on memory? Parasitical on us because it lacks everything that memory and humans have and that nature has. How could we confront this parasite? How could we defeat this parasite and cherish memory again? But at the same time, how could we perhaps even try to become less reflective? So much more endowed by memory that we need not reflect upon it. But that the way we think is a thinking out of memory, but not a reflective one, not one that has to reflect on its own reflection, right? The self-reflection of the self-reflection, but instead a thinking that does not reflect or imitate the what we find in memory, but really lives and breathes out of it, I think that might be the task that we have to engage in. Now, there are about, in my edition here, about 6 pages left. And this is then for the third one. That's a bit more than 6 pages. Sorry, I think it's about, almost 10. So, this was just about, I think, roughly 10 pages now. So we're going to read the rest next month. And until then, if you have any thoughts on what memory, this thinking out of memory might mean, do let me know. Send me an email. So thank you very much for listening indeed, and see you or hear you soon. Goodbye.